Hi, and welcome back to Ethics of Nature, Week 3, Part 2. So we were talking about bias, prejudice, racism, in groups, out groups, etc. So the point here is that Green's argument, and it's not just his, but others, is that tribalism as a foundation for moral behavior worked really well when we lived in small groups. The problem is that we're running into all kinds of weird conflicts, and it's making it harder for us to cooperate as we try to form these broader concentric circles that we were talking about in part 1 of the lecture. So we're still making pretty good moral decisions about how blame should be assigned, how we should do pro-social punishment, how to take care of one another when it comes to our smaller concentric circles, whatever those might be. But as we expand outwards, we're having more and more trouble expanding our moral behavior to include those people who exist in these broader areas of correspondence with us, right? So how do we make cooperation extend further out? Well, one answer that humans have, supplied over their history has been to give our power to make and to judge moral decision making to a third party. That is to say, okay, I am a member of a kingdom, right? The king and his court decides, right? Or I am a Canadian citizen, and therefore I give certain rights over to the Canadian justice system to adjudicate my role. And so do you. And so does everybody who lives inside this political agglomeration of people. This is called third party coercion, right? So instead of having to make all the moral decisions ourselves or within our groups, we defer some of that decision making power to a third party. Now, the problem is that this doesn't work that well because humans oftentimes don't feel as connected to the moral decision making made by some sort of overarching power, even though we're willing to kind of defer it to someone else, right? So we evolved to maintain cooperation together, and we evolved to do some of the pro-social punishing ourselves. That means to maintain the connection of the group by singling out someone who threatens our group cooperation by being overly selfish or not contributing as much, or by committing an act that threatens to destabilize the social order. And to do that ourselves, right? So we still have a hard time emotionally giving that power over to a third party. And it's much easier for us to challenge that third party's authority than it is to really feel emotionally as though they are making the right choice for us. So this is why people all the time complain about their government or whatever institution that they're having a conflict with, even though on a rational level they know, of course, that as an individual and as part of a group, they could never operate whatever it is that this government or institution is doing on their own, right? So we just don't connect with the moral decision making made by an institution the way we do with the moral decision making that's made by ourselves or within our group. So let's come back to this key point here, which is that cooperation, that is within these sort of tribal groups where we have really developed this capacity for pro-social punishment to manage these groups and make sure that everyone's cooperating, and we're exceptionally good at it, and many of our evolutionary adaptations, including our facial expressions and a lot of our communication And a lot of the way that we feel emotionally and the bonds that we form in our relationships are really kind of designed to maintain, to reinforce the cooperation that's necessary within a small group for us to thrive, right? So the point here is that humans would never have achieved what we have achieved. We never would be in the position that we're in without cooperation. So it really is the main reason why humans have been so successful as a species over time. And at the same time, maintaining this cooperation is really difficult because our success has created larger and larger and more diverse groups, where it's much more difficult to do the kind of pro-social punishing that we have evolved to do. So you see what I'm saying? There's a contradiction here in that we have achieved so much because of our exquisite evolutionary adaptations to cooperation, to maintaining cooperation through pro-social punishment. But that very success has created bigger and bigger groups that become much more difficult to manage. And then you have communication platforms like social media platforms that magnify this challenge by orders of magnitude. So how have we maintained cooperation in and through these challenges? Well, we've developed morality as a way of doing that, so that these moral rules, right, then can be extrapolated from our instincts and help us to maintain cooperation over a slightly bigger group, right, over time. But has morality really grown fast enough, right, to keep up with these expanding population sizes and their attendant group sizes? And the answer appears to be no, that we're still sort of confused in how these moral rules should apply. Should we apply the rules that we apply to our close-knit Italian families to everyone who lives inside the nation of Canada, or every human on the face of the earth? It seems too challenging, right? And so one of our goals here is to establish how morality can be brought out of this sort of very small, tight-knit group context into a bigger context. That's part of what we're up to here in the ethics of nature. So first of all, we need to take a step back and define pro-social punishment a little bit more clearly. So pro-social punishment means enforcing rules in such a way that cooperation isn't undermined, so that the goal of cooperation is actually strengthened, or at the very least maintained, right? So how do you punish someone in such a way that you can reincorporate them back into a group? This is a profound moral question, right? Now, beneath these pro-social punishments are a set of emotions, evolved emotions, that work to nudge us, to slightly push us towards these effective and productive and constructive pro-social punishments, right? So we have concern for others. We have a kind of ethics of care, right? That is caring for others as a principle of how to treat them morally, right? And this can flow from the feeling of empathy, that is, to feel someone else's pain, to feel their joy, right? And we have this sort of aversion to violence. That means that all of us, or almost all of us, really, regardless of whether or not we like to watch horror movies or not, we don't like violence being committed, and we have a physical aversion to it. So all of these emotional responses that are very instinctive, very intuitive, belong to a kind of constellation of feelings that have to do with basically this feeling of emotional connection with other human beings, and therefore, uh, we want to watch out for them. On the other hand, there are some emotions that we associate with negativity, but which are actually very important parts of pro-social punishment. So anger, right? Now, anger can be uh, many times out of control or wrong or misused. But in some cases, the emotion of anger is a moral response, right, to somebody doing something that is too selfish. And it's an appropriate response, particularly because anger shouldn't be continuous, but rather is a momentary response to feeling that someone has committed a selfish action. Disgust, similarly, right? Again, moral disgust, feeling like, oh, I can't believe you did that. Oh, right? Again, that's an emotion that should push us towards a certain kind of moral response, but that shouldn't be permanent, right? That should be momentary and that we should be able to get over, right? And now the flip side of these emotions is also forgiveness, which we've spoken about before, which is this feeling that people deserve second chances, that they can kind of come back into the fold, and also gratitude for when people have returned the favor, so to speak. So these emotions are centered around the moral principle of accountability and reciprocity, that there is a principle of fairness involved in relationships of all kinds, and that there is a give and take that's very important to find, to establish, to respect, and to maintain, right? Now, when we also commit acts, we feel shame, we feel guilt, right? Now, these feelings sometimes an embarrassment, right? We think of these as emotions to be avoided, and they are, but they also play a very important role in monitoring our own tendency towards selfishness and behaving overly in a self-interested fashion. On the other hand, we have feelings of loyalty, right? Sometimes humility, and this feeling of awe that lots of humans have described, which social psychologists believe helps to bring us together in these larger and larger groups like religion, right? So a religious feeling of awe is associated with humans' tendency to belong to these large groups. So we can also see some other important emotional responses that lead to this kind of pro-social punishment. Things like our tendency to judge, again, associated very strongly with negativity, however, plays an important role in how humans evaluate one another and how we enforce moral rules, right? This sorting into groups, we've talked about this. Embarrassment, again, things that we've talked about. The question is, there's a series of very highly evolved moral instincts in humans that we can identify. Is this enough, right, to produce consistently moral behavior, to produce the kinds of societies that we would like to live in? And here the answer seems to be no, that it worked when we lived in small tribal groups, but the fact of the matter is that we now live in complex societies and that involve a lot of diversity, and that seems to be the trend going forward. So we need somehow to reconcile these tensions, that we evolved a morality that's very tribal, very in-group oriented, but we live in these larger groups now, and we're likely to continue to do so in our children and generations going forward. So how do we make this bridge between our evolutionary minds, right, and the mind that lives in our modern world? So we will continue to ask this question going forward. Thank you, and see you soon.